Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Celine and today I'm going to be talking about a book that my patrons voted for me to make a video about. If you too would like to choose a book for me to make a standalone video on, then do check out my Patreon. I also post a lot of early access to my videos, so if you like having a sneak peek of what I'm up to, then definitely do check that out. The book I'm going to be talking about today is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. So Gaskell is a Victorian writer and she lived from 1810 to 1865. And her first novel was Mary Barton, which was published in 1848. I haven't read that one yet. I have read Cranford though, which was published in 1853. And that was originally published like a series of short stories. I have to admit, I didn't really get on with Cranford, but I had heard really excellent things about probably her most famous work, which is North and South, which was originally serialized between 1854 and 1855. Another book that Gaskell wrote that is of some significance is that she wrote a biography of Charlotte Bronte after Charlotte's death. And as far as I know, that is the first biography by a female author about a female author in the English language, which is also a book that I would very much like to read. Gaskell spent her childhood in Cheshire and her father was a Unitarian minister. And her father resigned on conscientious grounds, which is something that has found its way into this book. The main character's father also resigns due to a crisis of conscience. She later married a Unitarian minister and they moved to Manchester. And clearly that move and that change of scenery was quite an inspiration for Gaskell, because the main character of this novel also moves from a small rural place in the south into the more industrialized north. Originally, this book was serialized, which is quite normal for the Victorian era. A lot of things that we now see as novels were originally published in installments in magazines. It was published in Household Words, which was at the time edited by Charles Dickens. And it was actually Dickens who suggested the title of this book. We still have an extant letter where he suggests North and South, because originally Gaskell wanted to name this book just after the heroine, so it would be called Margaret Hale. However, Dickens suggested that a more thematic title would work better, and I mean, I have to agree with Dickens. I think North and South is a really great title for this book, and it does really capture the essence. And I think North and South is a book that is about many things, because in part it is a coming of age story. It is the story of one relatively young girl growing into more responsibility and basically finding herself through difficult circumstances. It is also a love story. That is something that a lot of people point out is quite a lovely love story. It of course deals with the cultural differences between the rural south, industrialized north, as I'd already mentioned. And specifically one of the issues that pops up in the industrial town that she has moved to is the relationship between workers and factory owners. And there is this Goodreads review that calls this Pride and Prejudice for Socialists, which I find a really fascinating way of looking at it. I would say that I agree with the sentiment in general, although I would add some caveats for people who don't know this book and are perhaps expecting something else if you compare it too much to Pride and Prejudice. It might give the impression that this book is derivative from Pride and Prejudice, which it certainly isn't. There are definitely similarities, but I would say that this book very much stands on its own. Additionally, the tone of it is quite different from Pride and Prejudice. I would say that the tone of North and South is, in a lot of ways, a lot darker than Pride and Prejudice is. So that is something to know if you are interested in reading the book, to maybe be slightly mentally prepared for that. In the rest of this video, I am going to talk a little bit about the themes of this book, because that's what I'm most interested in. I will not be talking about any specific plot points, but if you find that too much or too spoilerish, if I discuss a theme that might happen, then you may want to skip the rest of this video. Suffice to say that I think this book is excellent and I do very much recommend it. In terms of the thematic resonances in this book, it really reminded me of certain sections in Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, which isn't surprising considering they are both writing from a northern perspective. They both lived in the north of England, not necessarily within the exact same region. Charlotte Bronte was living in Yorkshire, whereas Gaskell was in Manchester. But despite some of the geographical differences, there would have been a lot of overlap in terms of social issues that would arise in industrial towns in the first half of the 19th century. So in Shirley, there's quite an important scene as well where the main character witnesses a riot regarding, I'm going to be vague, you don't want to have too much detail, but there is something similar that happens. It's not the same scene or anything like that, but there are definitely similarities between that and North and South. And the position that Gaskell takes I found really interesting. So she is very interested in the idea that feminine compassion can sort of bridge the differences that workers and factory owners had. And she tries to argue that their interests are actually the same, that if they are brought together, perhaps through feminine sensibility, that these conflicts can be resolved without violence, without rioting, or anything like that. From a contemporary perspective, I would say that to a certain extent, I consider this perhaps slightly naive because, as we have seen throughout the centuries, I would say from a 21st century perspective, we would say that the needs and motivations between workers and factory owners, or as we would say in the 21st century, the shareholders, often are oppositional. Paying less wages directly benefits the owner. But I think for Gaskell, this is much less of an issue because she is approaching this with a religious and moralistic background. So for her, a good factory owner would always be concerned with the well-being of their workers, which in reality that compassion might not be quite as far-reaching as Gaskell is imagining it. But I do think for a Victorian novel, it poses some really interesting questions about, what is a woman's position in what is traditionally seen as quite a male world, the world of industry. Although I would add a footnote that a lot of women did work in factories. So the idea of having separate spheres in this sense, for working class women, that idea didn't really exist. It is very much middle class and upper class women who were excluded from those types of spaces and who were excluded from discussions around economy, around society, and basically anything outside of the home. And you can see the main character, Margaret, sort of struggling through these ideas of what her place is and whether she can or can't intervene. But I think one of the most joyful parts about North and South is that Margaret is quite a strong character. Although she is certainly constrained by Victorian morals, she very much stands for what she cares for. And I think it's incredibly easy to root for Margaret. I think she's one of my favourite heroines that I have met in Victorian fiction so far, so... Returning to the point that this is like Socialist Pride and Prejudice, I would say the love story is indeed quite close to Pride and Prejudice, and I quite liked the love interest. He just really, really likes Margaret. He can't help himself, and even though when she is seemingly quite proud, when she pushes him away, he still absolutely adores her, which I think is very sympathetic and makes him a hero that you can really root for. However, the thing that I think makes North and South, it's an excellent read, don't get me wrong, but I did find it quite dark and heavy at times, and that is because the theme of death that is quite recurrent throughout the plot. To be fair, to Victorians, death was very much on their mind. There was a lot of burial reform during this period, so the idea of death was just a lot more present. It was a lot more socially present. Additionally, there were very large health crises in this era, so it was honestly quite common for people to just die, sometimes without warning, sometimes it was just unclear why they were ill. In terms of diagnostic tools, they just didn't have the same amount of technology available to them that we do now. Quite often people would die quite young, and these are all things that are included in the book in some way. And the way death is used in this book is that they are moments of growth for Margaret, because a lot of the book is about change, it's about metamorphosis, it's about the passing of time, it is also about the change of place. So Margaret, for example, at one point revisits the South and it's not quite how she remembered it. So it certainly didn't seem to me like including death in this story was gratuitous, or, sometimes I feel like in books the author just really enjoys torturing the main character, which is not something I personally enjoy in fiction. But that is very much not the case in this book. But it does mean that the book is a bit darker, because it does deal with grief quite a lot. It's certainly not a tragedy necessarily, but I did feel like when I got to the end that I was like, goodness me, we have been through a war. We have come out, but we have not come out unscathed. So overall, I really loved North and South. I loved the themes. I thought there was so much to really dig into. Like, this is quite a meaty story, and on the surface level it is quite a simple story. It is just a love story, and it is a coming of age story, and at the same time though there's so much to explore. A lot of the characters are really likable. Again, I think Margaret is fantastic. I also felt like the story moved along at a good speed, so I definitely didn't think it dragged in any place. So I completely agree with everyone who said, oh, if you don't like Cranford, you should definitely still try North and South. They were all right. So if, like me, you didn't love Cranford or tried something else by Gaskell and didn't get on with it, I think you should still give North and South a try. So those are my thoughts on North and South. If you want to choose a book for me to make one of these videos for, please do check out my Patreon. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well. I hope to see you again soon in some other video. Bye!